Hi kids, Adam Gorightly here, aka the Wrong Reverend Houdini Kundalini of the Church of Unwavering Indifference. And I'm recording this video today to talk about the history of the Principia Discordia, hopefully clear up some of the confusion, misinformation, and downright bad information out there regarding the Principia Discordia. As you may or may not know, or even care for that matter, I'm the author of this book, The Prankster and the Conspiracy, the story of Kerry Thornley, who was a co-founder of Discordianism with Greg Hill. As I was researching the prankster back in the day, about a dozen years ago or more, I started networking and interacting with some of those original early Discordians. And among them was Bob Newport, who was really the third co-founder in the Holy Trinity of Discordianism with Hill and Thornley. And when Greg Hill died in 2000, Newport inherited Hill's Discordian archives, and for some crazy reason, in 2009, Newport decided to pass those on to me. And contained within the Discordian archives are the Principia Discordia archives, which contain all the different editions of the Principia Discordia that Greg Hill was involved with. And I will show those to you now. So here it is, folks, the fabled first edition of the Principia Discordia, or How the West Was Lost, published in 1965 in New Orleans, of which there were only 5 copies produced, according to Kerry Thornley, most of which were lost. Now, there are a few other things floating around on the web these days, which some claim to be the first edition. That's inaccurate, and I'll discuss these inaccuracies towards the end of this video, so don't turn that dial. Here we have the table of contents, including such things as information about the Pentagon, and there's a table of disorganization, information about the founding of the Discordian Society. And so this first edition is roughly 59 pages, and it's a combination of text and illustrations. There's a number of illustrations, such as this one on one of the most holiest of Discordian shrines, the Pentagon. And there's a number of other illustrations in the book, such as the Sacred Cow, one of the early illustrations Greg Hill did of the Sacred Cow. Here we have the Orders of Eris, the Knights of the Five-Sided Temple. And here we have the Apocalyptic Prophets, local number 666. And here's the last page of the first edition. You can see here it says this is copy number 1 of 5. 5 copies. And then you'll see some Discordian Society membership cards here. Here's Greg Hill's card, Malaclypse the Younger, Omnibenevolent Polyfather of Virginity and Gold, Office of High Priesthood, House of Apostles of Eris, the Golden Apple Cores. And here's another early membership card. The Discordian Society shows different members during this early period, such as Lord Omar Khayyam Ravenhurst, who was Kerry Thornley, and Fang the Unwashed, who was Roger Levin, and of course Gregory Hill. So there you have it, boys and girls, the first edition of the Principia Discordia, or How the West Was Lost. And here we see the second edition, published in 1969 in Los Angeles. And you can see the direction had changed quite a bit from the first edition. It's about a dozen pages, teeny weeny tiny little font size. Some of these illustrations you'll see here ended up in the 4th edition. So you can see here, this is number 1 of 100 copies produced in Los Angeles. And here you see the 3rd edition, which is becoming a bit more refined, sold for a whopping $1. This was produced in Tampa, Florida, also in 1969, when Greg Hill was visiting Carrie Thornley, who lived in Tampa during that period. Once again, this is about a dozen pages or so, and you start seeing some of these illustrations that would end up in the 4th edition. Tells you the inside story of Discordianism. There you see the back cover, quite similar to what would be on the back cover of the 4th edition, which I'll show to you now. And here we see the 4th edition, published in San Francisco in 1970 by Ripoff Press, consisting of 1,000 copies. And this is the most commonly known version that later ended up being published by Loom Panics, and I'll show you those editions in a bit. And if you were given a copy by Greg Hill during that period, you would get a Pope card, and also included was the 5th edition, which inside contained this Western Union telegram with a bunch of M's on it. And here's a copy of the actual Western Union telegram that Greg Hill used for that 5th edition. As the story goes, he was this was during the period he was working at Western Union, and at one point the teletype machine got stuck and spit out hundreds of these telegrams with the M on them, which to Greg represented the universal and so for whatever reasons that became the 5th edition. So in 1975, the Illuminatus trilogy, written by Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea, was published, and the first book in that series was dedicated to none other than Greg Hill and Carrie Thornley. Illuminatus, of course, became a big hit in the counterculture, kind of wacky sci-fi conspiracy book. And within the Illuminatus trilogy, the Principia Discordia is mentioned many times. And so people weren't sure what was fact and what was fiction in the Illuminatus trilogy, and if this was even a real book, the Principia Discordia. And one of the people wondering this was Michael Hoy, the publisher at Loom Panics Unlimited. And so Michael Hoy was able to track down Greg Hill and get his own copy of the Principia Discordia. And then in 1978 decided to bring the Principia Discordia to a larger audience, and Hoy published this Loom Panics edition of the Principia Discordia, which was basically a reproduction of the 4th edition, except with a different cover, as well as a introduction by Michael Hoy. That was 1978. And then in 1980, Loom Panics came out with another version. This is the one most commonly known by folks. Once again, it's a reproduction of the 4th edition, except with a different cover, and an introduction by Robert Anton Wilson, and an afterword by Gregory Hill. Other notable editions include the Illuminate Press version published in 1991 with a introduction by Kerry Thornley. 1994, the Stephen Jackson Games version was published. And then one of my favorite versions was done by Saint Sin in 2007, which includes the Robert Anton Wilson and Kerry Thornley introductions, as well as outroductions by yours truly and Dr. John Swaby, the noted Australian Discordian historian. So let's return our discussion to the first edition of the Principia Discordia, which, as legend has it, was produced after hours on Jim Garrison's mimeograph machine. Of course, Jim Garrison was the New Orleans district attorney who later indicted Kerry Thornley as part of a JFK assassination conspiracy. And so this has been the popular legend over the years, and it was first came to my attention in Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Trigger. And it's a myth, partly true and partly not true, that I as well have propagated over the years. But in recent years I've dug a little deeper to find out if this was actually true. Now, in the Kerry Thornley introduction to the Principia Discordia, which you'll find in the Illuminate version, he claims that the person who worked in Garrison's office was named Lane Kaplinger. And in recent years, I've been in communication with Grace Kaplinger, aka Grace Zabriskie, the famous actress who's appeared in a wide range of things over the years, from Seinfeld to I guess she's in Downton Abbey now. And as well, she was Laura Palmer's mother in Twin Peaks. And she was friends with Kerry Thornley and the sister of Lane Kaplinger, who apparently was in on producing the Principia Discordia when she worked as a typist in Garrison's office. And I posed this question to Grace recently, basically asked if this was true, that the Principia Discordia was produced on Jim Garrison's mimeograph machine, whether this was true, legend, or a combination of both. And she posed that question to Lane, and Lane replied, "Legend. I recall occasional Discordianism, reading, and giggling only." However, during the first period, Greg Hill and Kerry Thornley were in New Orleans. They were producing various Discordian memos, writings, and whatnot. And Lane Kaplinger did copy some of these writings on the mimeograph machine in Garrison's office. So that's kind of where the legend came from. If you look in the afterword to the fourth edition, the Lumponics edition of the Principia Discordia, Greg notes that the first edition was actually published in 1965 during the second period. He was in New Orleans, and it was done by a guy who worked for the Xerox company on the actual Xerox company machines. This was in the early days of Xeroxography. And so now you know the rest of the story. Now, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I did a Freedom of Information request. This is when I was researching the Thornley book, and I forget who I filed with, the FBI, CIA. I was trying to find out if they had anything on Thornley, and when I got the reply back, they said this material had already been released, all these Thornley files, into the National Archives. So I put in my request to get all this stuff from the National Archives, and lo and behold, there was something in there that appeared to be the first edition of the Principia Discordia. And so when I came across this document at the time, it didn't mean a whole lot to me. I was more interested in the conspiratorial aspects related to Kerry Thornley, and not so much into Discordianism back in those days, so I kind of set it aside. In recent years, as I've been kind of going over this material, the first edition, and comparing it to this other version, what I've discovered is this version is a partial edition. There's no, except for the frontispiece, there's no illustration. Also, the typeset is different. I think Carrie Thornley must have took Greg Hill's version at one point and typed up another version. And also there's pages missing from this that are in the real first edition. And so what I think is Thornley created this edition, made some copies, and one of them he sent out to a lady named Barbara Reed. And if you look in here somewhere, you'll see a membership certificate to Barbara Reed that Carrie sent along with this. So I think this was Barbara Reed's copy. Barbara Reed became a witness against Carrie Thornley in the Garrison's investigation. Later in the 70s, she was a witness to the House Select Committee on Assassination. I think she provided this to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Either she provided it or Carrie Thornley provided it. It's hard to say. But I think one of Garrison's contentions was that the Discordian Society had been a CIA front organization and that they were somehow involved in the Kennedy assassination. So that's where this version came from. So if you go to the Principia Discordia Wikipedia page, it says, in 1978, a copy of a work from Carrie Thornley titled The Principia Discordia, or How the West Was Lost, was placed in the House Select Committee on Assassination's JFK collections. A scan of this document has been identified as the first edition. Anyway, this is incorrect. It's only a partial later edition, but trying to correct Wikipedia at times is an impossible task. So there you go. Around 2005 or so, Dr. John Swaby came across this. Swaby, I'll just call him Dr. John from now on. I'm not sure how he pronounces his last name. He came across this material and it blew his mind. He went, oh my God, the first edition of the Principia Discordia has been discovered. And so he posted this to the web, and kind of during that same period or a couple years afterwards, I worked with Dr. John on a project of some other Discordian materials I had from the Discordian archives, and we posted that to his website and called it Appendixia Discordia. And then short time afterwards, I had some misgivings about putting that stuff on the web, so I yanked it down because I wanted to use it for future book projects, and I didn't want it to get scattered willy-nilly across the web, which kind of happened anyway. So in around that time, after it got pulled down, maybe 2007 or so, Saint Sin, the guy who produced that fine edition of the Principia Discordia I showed you, he came up with something called the Holy First Edition, which people have also misconfused as being the first edition of the Principia Discordia. And what it is, he basically took this here edition and kind of added some graphics to it, retyped certain pages that you couldn't make out, but he also added the Appendixia Discordia, which included pages such as this, for instance. And so what the Holy First Edition is really a mishmash of different stuff, a little bit of this, and a little bit of smatterings of the Appendixia Discordia, which had been posted on the web, and it's kind of stirred up into a Discordian soup of sorts, but it is not the first edition. There's only one first edition, and it is this edition. And this edition will appear in its entirety along with a lot of other cool stuff in a forthcoming book project on the history of Discordianism. Also, another project I'm working on with Fiji Press is a book project called the Paste Up Discordia, where we actually have the original paste ups Greg Hill used to put together the 4th edition of the Principia Discordia, and I'll show you one of these paste ups right now. And so that's the Paste Up Discordia book project, and we're also in the process of preserving these materials and hopefully at one point putting them on display, maybe even do a little road show where we can take them across the country and share them with our fellow Discordians. So stay tuned. This was Adam Gorightly reporting from the Discordian Archives West. Peace out.